Hi everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we are going to discuss about a very important topic in Terraform, which is functions. Now in almost any organizations that you will be working with where Terraform is being used, you will see that the functions are one of the common topics that are implemented as part of the code. And this is the reason why it is important for us to understand about this topic in detail, not only from the exam perspective but also from the real world scenarios. Now before we explore the Terraform functions, it is first important for us to understand the basics of function. Now function is not just limited to Terraform. Even in other languages, say you're learning Python. Even in Python you have the concept of function, which is very identical. So at a high level overview, a function is a block of code that performs a specific task. Let's understand this with a simple diagram where you have a function that you see over here. Now each function, it requires some kind of an input and it provides some kind of an output. So within here, let's say that we have provided input where we have three numbers 10, 30 and 20. So this input is being given to the function, and in the output, the function has given a result of 30. So based on the input and output, can you identify what exactly this function does? And the answer is max. So what is the max number among all of this is what function is returning in the output. Now the main benefit of function here is that you don't have to write a piece of code to perform this specific task. Otherwise, if this max function is not present, then you will have to create a code from scratch that has the logic to identify which is the maximum number and provide to you the output. Since the function is present for you, you can go ahead and use it directly. Now when we discuss about Python, there are multiple built-in functions that are available and each function does a specific task. For example, we were discussing about the max function here. Now what does this max function does? It returns the largest item in an iterable or the largest of two or more arguments. Alright, so instead of creating the entire code from scratch, you can use the built-in functions that are being provided and that can do the job for you in a much more easier way. Now similar to what we saw in Python, even in Terraform, there are multiple built-in functions that are available for us that can make our life simple. One of the function here is max. Now from the name itself, we can identify that the max function takes one or more numbers and it returns the greatest numbers. So if we look into it from the practical perspective, you see you have the max function that is being used. It is taking multiple set of numbers like 10, 20 or 30, and in the output it gives you the greatest of all the number. In this case it is 30. This is one function. Let's take an example of one more function that is available in Terraform, and the function number 2 for this PPT is called as file. Now at a high level overview, the file function reads the contents of a file at a given path and returns them as a string. So let's understand this with a screenshot where we are using a file function. Inside the file function, we have specified a path to a file. In this case, it is random-file.txt, and in the output of this function, you get whatever the contents of these files are. Like this is a text file present in a folder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So all of these are the contents of the random-file.txt. Now again, at this stage, it does not really make sense on why functions are really used. For example, why do you make use of a file function? What is the importance of it from real world perspective? So all of these things we'll be discussing in just a moment. However, at this stage, let's go ahead and quickly look into how we can run the function to test the functionality. Now at a high level overview, there is a specific feature called as Terraform console, which allows us to run various kind of a function for our test environment, and it allows you to also test and evaluate the expressions here. So the overall syntax is you type the Terraform console and then you can test various set of functions that you'd like. So let's go ahead and try it out. Now for today's demo, I am in a folder of KP Labs Terraform. First, let's do one thing. Let's go ahead and create a test file. I'll just call it as random file here. And within here, I'll say this is a random file for testing. You can add any contents here. I'll go ahead and I'll save this and I'll close the notepad. Once done, I'll just open up the terminal. And from here, as we were discussing, there is a specific feature called as Terraform console. When you type this, it gives you the prompt, and within this prompt, you can test your functions, whatever you might be adding as part of your Terraform code. So first, let's go ahead and test the max function. So here you can add any number. Let me add just random number here and I'll press enter. And in the output, it shows you the greatest number of all. So this is the max function that we were discussing. Let's also explore one more function called as the file function. And within here, you can specify the location of a file and it will give you the output of that file. So let's say random-file.txt. I'll press enter and you see it gave you the output of the file. Great. So at this stage, we learned the basics of function. We learned on how we can test the functions. Now the question that comes is, what exactly is the use of functions? For example, the file function. What exactly is the use of it? Is it really required? And this is what we are going to discuss in the next slide. So let's go ahead and discuss the importance of file function from real world perspective. Now at a high level overview, the file function can reduce your Terraform code size significantly by loading the contents from external sources during your Terraform operations. Now let's understand this with a screenshot where what you are doing here, you are creating a simple IAM policy which allows certain actions, like it allows all actions on EC2 service, it allows all actions on Elastic Load Balancing service and so on. So what you are doing, you are creating a IAM policy called as demo user policy, and this policy has this JSON code. Now this JSON code can be say 20 lines, it can be 50 lines, it can be 100 lines and so on. So this is the before example. Now using the file function, what you can do, you can move this entire JSON code to a separate file. In this case, it is called as a EC2 policy.json. And what you can do, you can make use of the file function here. So if you see here, policy is equal to, then you add the entire JSON code here. However, instead of doing that and making your Terraform code size much more larger and difficult to maintain, what you have done, you have added this entire code in a JSON file and you are loading that file using the file function. So now if you compare the overall size, it is much more trimmed down and it is also much more easier to read. Alright, so let's also go ahead and understand this practically. Now for today's practical, similar to the screenshot that we were discussing, let's explore what exactly the code is all about. The code is as part of a file called as functions.tf, and again this code is committed in GitHub so that you can reference to it. Great. So here what we are doing is, first we are creating a IAM user called as the demo kplabs user. Now this user, generally whenever you create a user in AWS, the user does not really have any permission. So what you do, you also add some kind of a policy to the user that defines what kind of permission the user will have. And this is what the policy is all about. So let's do one thing. Before we try this out practically, I'll just show you the overall workflow through the GUI console so even the non-AWS users understand what we are trying to achieve. Now from the AWS console, let me go to the IAM service, and within the IAM service, what we are going to do, we are going to create a new user. So let's say that a new team member has joined the organization and he needs access to the AWS account. So what you can do, you can create a user. So here what we are doing, first we are creating the user. The name of the user is demo kplabs user. Again, you don't have to try it out. I'm just showing to avoid any confusion. All right. So this is the username. We are not going to add any permissions at this stage. I'll just create a user. Alright, so this is the user that is created. Now, this user does not have any permission. Here you see there is no permission. So when the demo kplabs user, he logs into the AWS account, he'll not be able to do anything. Now, depending upon what we want the user to be able to do in AWS, we can go ahead and assign some kind of a permission. So for example, there are multiple policies. You can attach an administrator access policy and so on. So generally, whenever you attach any policy behind the scenes, it is a JSON document. You see, this policy behind the scenes is a JSON document that defines what kind of permissions are present. Alright. Let me just remove this policy here. So what this code is doing, first it is creating a new user in AWS, then it is adding a specific policy for the user. What this policy is doing, it is giving permission on various services like EC2, CloudWatt, auto-scaling and so on. You don't have to understand it in detail. You just have to understand that this is some kind of a JSON policy which gives some kind of permission for this specific user. So let's do one thing. Before we do a Terraform apply, I'll just go ahead and I'll delete this user. I'll delete this user here. Great. Now I'll just do a Control D to come out of our Terraform console. I'll clear the screen. Let's go ahead and do a Terraform validate. So it is stating that the AWS provider is not available. That is fine. You can do a quick init to fix this issue. Alright, so once this is done, you can run the Terraform validate once again. And at this stage, the code looks good. So with this said, let's go ahead and do a Terraform apply with auto approve. Alright, so our apply is completed. Now if you refresh this, you see that we have one user called as demo KP Labs user that is created, and associated with the user, there must be a permission policy. Let's refresh it. So here you see a demo user policy is available, and in this user policy we have all of this JSON based policy that is available here that you see as part of this. Alright, now this is the base code. So now what you have to do, you have to make use of Terraform function and make this code much more smaller, because this is a relatively bigger code, and at a later stage there are higher chances of making mistakes while you are editing it. So it is better to make things much more simpler. So now what you can do, instead of having all of this as part of the TF file, you can add it in a separate file altogether. It will make much more better sense. So let's do one thing. Let's copy it from here till here. Alright. I'll do a Control X. And here, in fact, you will see that there is one more function that is used called as JSON encode. Now, what we are going to do, we are going to create a file called as iamuserpolicy.json, and I'll add the entire JSON code here. I'll save it. So now our code looks much more sleek. So now what you can do in the policy, what we want that the policy JSON should be loaded from this specific file, which is the external source from the TF. So now you can make use of the file function. Now, if you remember the overall syntax of file function, it looks like this. You specify file and then you specify the location of the file as well as the file name. In a similar way, here you can specify file and then you can specify the location of the file which is in the same path. The name of file is iam-user-policy.json. Alright, you can go ahead and you can save this. Now at this stage, if you do a Terraform plan, ideally it should show you no changes. You see, it shows you no changes because the earlier larger code and the current smaller code does the same thing. There are no changes. It's just that we have moved the entire contents of the policy to a separate file and we are loading it through the file function. However, to avoid any confusion, let's go ahead and do a Terraform destroy auto approve. And we'll be recreating it with the newer code and we'll see if the same kind of effect is been replicated here. Alright, so this is destroyed. I'll do a Terraform apply with auto approve. Apply is completed. Within here, let's go back to users. Let's refresh this. We have the demo KP Labs user, and within here, we have the entire policy set that is available. Alright, so I hope with this practical exposure, you now understood the importance of function in Terraform. Now, similar to file function, again, there are a lot of functions that are available. Each one has its separate kind of use cases. Now, at a high level overview, we have to keep a note that Terraform has wide variety of functions available. Each function again has a separate kind of use case. Now, what HashiCorp has done is that they have grouped functions into multiple categories. So you have numeric functions, string function, collection functions, and so on. So these are high level categories, and in each of the category, there are multiple set of functions that are available. Let's also explore this from documentation perspective. Now currently I am in the documentation associated with functions. Now as we're discussing, it is giving an example of max function. Now as we're discussing that there are multiple set of functions that are available in Terraform, you see under functions you have various categories. So you have numeric function, string function, collection function, and so on. If you open numeric function, you will see there are multiple set of functions available here. If you see string function, again there are multiple set of functions available here. Now if you have to identify where exactly our file function would be, it is much more easier. So it should be in the file system function. If I'll open this, you would see that you have a file function. In fact, if you open the file function, it gives you a great description on what this function is all about along with the example. So it becomes much more easier for us to understand how things work. Great. Now before we conclude today's video, there is one very important pointer that you have to keep a note specifically from exam perspective, which is Terraform language does not support user-defined function. So only the functions that are built in the language are available for use. Now we have seen in the documentation that there are so many functions that are available. So these are the functions that you can use for your day-to-day activities. And this is what again the second pointer is all about. So that's a very high level overview about the importance and what Terraform functions are all about. Again, we are going to discuss about functions in great detail in the upcoming set of videos. So stay tuned.